sort of, cultural figures, it's a really distinctly mixed record. There are some people who have written some sympathetic, supposedly, things about Greek Jews, but I'll give you an example. Yorgos Ioannou, who was widely praised for his novels in which he puts Jewish characters in. He grew up in Salonika before the war. If you actually look at what he writes, it's terribly stereotypical. And there's a passage in his memoir, a sort of slightly fictionalized memoir about his father, who drove a train to Belgrade during the deportations, and it tries to be terribly sympathetic to him. And if you contrast that with, remember Landsman's famous treatment of the train drivers in Poland, it's quite extraordinary. And yet Ioannou was, there was an entire edition of Chronigal, which is the Jewish community publication, memorializing him because he at least bothered to remember them. Not terribly favourably, but he bothered to remember them. And then you have people like Theodorakis, who recently made some anti-Semitic statements, but who in the past has condemned anti-Semitism. It's a very mixed record, but generally speaking, they don't care, frankly. They just do not care. And then in terms of journalists, well, it's just pathetic. As for the Jewish community, look, they're in a very difficult position. They are a very small community. The numbers have actually, I think, recently actually gone below 5,000, which was considered to be a sort of a barrier. They are under pressure to prove their loyalty, hence they funded this ridiculous Greek Foreign Ministry volume of documents on Greek Jews. It's an interesting volume. If you open it, the first document, this sort of sets the tone, the first document says something like, all of the Jewish allegations contained in the telegram from Ambassador Koromolas are entirely false, So this is the whole tone of the volume, and it's full of documents, telling you that 10 drachmas were given to the Jewish communal school in Veria to buy pencils, So the whole volume is about, the terribly generous Greek government being so terribly nice to its Jewish minority, and they're always bloody complaining. And that sort of tone, that sort of approach is continually there, and that's why they basically don't say terribly much unless it's really egregious. But even then, I mean, the stress is on proving our loyalty. If you look at the Jewish Museum in Athens, it's very interesting. As it was done before by Nikos Stavroulakis, who's now in Crete, it situated Greek Jewry within the context of Ottoman Jewry, which is how you should do it. The way the museum's done now is to stress the Greekness of Greek Jewry and what good patriots Greek Jews were. And it's really rather sad that that's the approach they have to take. Just quickly on the violence, what's very interesting about anti-Semitic violence in Greece is how little there has been when you compare it to other Balkan countries. Political violence in Greece, there's been an awful lot of. And I'll give you an example. During the First World War, there was an incident, I think called the September Events, in which Athenian Greeks turned on refugees from Asia Minor and killed over 100 of them in a sort of, massacre. And yet the total number of deaths from anti-Semitic violence was lower than that during the last 2 centuries. The difference was, of course, that when it came to the Holocaust in Salonika, there wasn't much violence or actual participation. There was administrative collaboration, quite a lot of that, but there was a very notable indifference to what happened, and that meant that there were very few escapees and a very low survival rate. So, again, because there hasn't been the violence, the sort of incidents you get in other European countries where you have documented, proof of local Christians dressing up in German uniforms and this sort of thing, Greeks have been able to deny this. And again, that's why the intellectuals have been able to carry on with the myth that, we were the best nation in Europe. I think Venezis, who was the biographer of Damaskinos, actually said in his biography of Damaskinos something like, Greece is the only country that can sort of approach the issue of its reaction to the Holocaust with serenity. Strange comment.
Apropos Stavroulakis. Stavroulakis refurbished, or in fact, he rebuilt the synagogue in Chania in Crete. When the synagogue was inaugurated, you want to, the letter he got from the...
Okay, there's a law of 1920 in Greece that defines what a Jewish community is, and it has to be a minimum of 20 families. That's just a legal thing. Anyhow, when he was opening the synagogue, and Mitsotakis, the previous head of New Democracy, was invited, and the usual stuff, he got a letter from the local prefect saying, what are you doing? You can't open this. This cannot be a functioning religious venue. There isn't a community here. This is just for some passing tourist.
Or Zionists.
Yeah, and it was extraordinary. This was a public letter from a Greek official. And there was the usual, criticism, and the official basically didn't turn up. And this was the same guy, as I recall, who publicly said that no American should ever step foot in Hanya again after the Kosovo War. If you actually go to the port, you'll actually see some of the restaurants have pictures of visiting American submarines. So clearly he wasn't listened to. There was an outcry about that, but nothing happened. He kept his job. It was forgotten the next day. But this was, a blatant infringement of religious freedom, a blatant expression of bigotry, and there was no response.
Max?
There's two things. One is a small factual question. Sounds to me like it'd be quite unsafe to go to the Olympics if the Greeks haven't believed in terrorism. But the big question is, there's been some feeling in some part of Greek society, I gather, that to put the conflict with Turkey behind them, that's old-fashioned, and now is the time to move into the future, parallel to a similar feeling in Turkey. Could you give me a feel for just how that relates to all the rest of Greece? Is it a very narrow group of people, or is it something that's moving in the society, or just how this new accommodating relationship to Turkey fit in with?
Just on the Olympics, quickly, I think the problem was, until last week, that they genuinely took the view that they're not a target themselves. Greece itself is not a target for Arab terrorism. So it wasn't a problem. They genuinely took that view.
So in
But
designing
now,
everything, they didn't prepare for it.
They haven't even built the stadium. So I mean,
The roof.
the roof is. It's the preparations. I've got a friend who's in charge of security. Nice bloke. Doesn't carry a key to his own house because he loses it and walks in through his own French windows. He was working in security for the Olympics. Lovely bloke, but still. The security precautions are grossly inadequate. The whole preparation has been grossly inadequate. They won the bid in '96, arguing that 70% of the infrastructure was in place. I don't actually know what that means. The problem was that until a few months ago, 70% of the infrastructure was still in place, and the other 30% still had not been built. Security is a major problem. This is a country with very open borders as well. That's not that the borders can't be closed. They've been closed in the past. But, there is a racket going on whereby, if you are an Iranian or an Iraqi, you pay between $5,000 and $10,000. And there are very kind border officials in Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria, and Romania, whatever, who will facilitate you on your journey to Germany or the UK. So it's very easy to get into this country. And there is, after the junta, there was a feeling that the intelligence services had been too powerful, and understandably, they were left to pretty much rot because people didn't want domestic surveillance. They'd had too much of it. The problem is that you do need a certain level in a democracy, and their domestic security is really extremely weak. With regard to the relations with Turkey, this was very much pushed by George Papandreou and his own team. In terms of the broad mass of public opinion, I think a lot of them are indifferent. It's really not an issue. The key issue is Cyprus, and that's sort of being resolved. The difficulty is that New Democracy were constantly sniping at this for electoral advantage. I mean, this is the sort of country where, flying the flag does some good. My own view is that what's happened in Turkey since last year is you've now got a government which is very, very willing to play ball with someone like George Papandreou, and if the successor to Papandreou proves to take a similar stance, I think it won't be a problem. I think the current government in Turkey is very keen to get the Greece issue off its desk, and so I think that I mean they've just got too many other fish to fry, as it were. So
but that's just at the diplomatic level. In terms of any feeling in the society,
it's really, I think within the media it's an issue. For journalists, it's always an issue, to prove their patriotism supposedly. But I get the impression that within Greek society, anti-Americanism is now much more interesting to them than caring about Turkey. And I mean, this is the funny thing about last year, and they were really, I was there at the time, they were really confused. When the Turkish parliament voted to basically stab the Americans in the back, I mean, they didn't know whether or not to cheer, like, great, the Americans have just been really knifed by their supposed lackey and ally, or to say, oh, Turks are getting assertive, maybe they're going to go after us. They were a little bit confused. I mean, I said to them, hey, you should be cheering what's happening in Iraq. I mean, you're so bigoted against Muslims, you should be cheering this on. And they were like, oh, no, terrible, innocent Iraqis. It was interesting, the Greek media during the Iraq War basically reran Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. I mean, you saw every civilian casualty, just dubbed over in Greek. The only time they showed British media was when the B-52s were taking off from Fairford. That was it. It was extraordinary. I mean, and in fact, the US ambassador said, I think at one point, that they need to watch less Al Jazeera and more CNN.
Judge Bach.
Actually, I hadn't been to Greece for some time, but I mean, there are lots of Israeli tourists there. Would an ordinary Israeli tourist who visits today, let's say, Greece, or goes to the hotels or in any public place, would he come across any serious feeling of anti-Semitism in an ordinary way? I mean, if not in an exceptional place here or there. That's one thing. The other thing is about the general attitude. I'm a bit known as a notorious optimist and selective memory for more pleasant experiences. But I mean, I was the state attorney of Israel in the past, and you remember in 1970 there was an attack on an El Al plane in Essex Airport, and one Israeli was killed, and that was still at the time of the government of the colonels, and there were rumors that they wanted to close the file against the terrorists who were arrested. So I was sent to Greece to prevent that. People told me you might wake up in a concentration camp in one of the islands as well. But anyway, I tried, and I must say I had a very cordial reception on the part of the prosecutor, of the main prosecutor in Greece. Not only that, I suggested a lot of evidence against terrorism. He used all that evidence. He even asked me to help draft the final summing up against the terrorism. And what's even more important, because I mean he himself might be a special person, but the court in fact inflicted maximum punishment on these terrorists. And I also saw in the reaction in the local press a strong feeling, actually, I thought, against terrorism and in favor of the heavy punishment which was inflicted on the terrorists. So have things changed since then, especially if this was still at the time of the colonels, or was it something exceptional? Or are there even now, let's say, in the various government departments, different attitudes, some of them more favorable to Israel maybe, or more opposed to terrorism than others, like you have in some other countries as well?
Just on Israeli tourists, I don't really know, but I mean, obviously, if they don't read Greek, they're not going to encounter it. But my impression is that people will encounter prejudicial comments, but that's about as far as it goes. There's no violence. I mean, actually, I've met an Israeli who they work in a hotel in Paros or something. They've got some sort of hotel in Paros. I mean, I think relative to other countries, I think it's pretty safe, frankly, because it's if there is anything, it's verbal. With regard to the government attitude in 1970, well, obviously things have changed a lot since then, and my impression is that it's not a big priority for the government. Israel's not a big priority, but the main place where there's going to be attitudes that matter is the foreign ministry. And over the last 20-odd years of socialist rule, it has become absolutely the uniform view in the foreign